Good morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second keynote. My name is Aditya Bharadwaj from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies.
Good morning to all. I'm so happy to be here with Adi this morning. My name is Marlene Sahakian here at the University of Geneva, and we have the great pleasure of presenting a keynote who is in another time zone today. She's situated in India, and so we had to also accommodate that time zone with this morning's session. Amita Baviskar, who is Professor of Environmental Studies, Sociology and Anthropology at Ashoka University in India. Baviskar studies the cultural politics of environmental and development issues in rural and urban India. She completed her master's in sociology from the Delhi School of Economics and then a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University. Amita Baviskar has taught at the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, at the Sociology Unit, Institute of Economic Growth, up till 2020, and she is head of Department for Environmental Studies at Ashoka University in Delhi. Baviskar has been a visiting scholar at numerous universities, including Stanford University, Cornell University, Yale University, Sciences Po, and the University of California at Berkeley. She has also been a visiting fellow at the University of Cape Town, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford. She's a prolific writer, and I must say a wonderful writer. It's really been a pleasure to read her work, starting with early works in 1995 in The Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts over Development in the Narmada Valley, which was reissued in a second edition, or Waterscapes, The Cultural Politics of a Natural Resource, and one of my favorites, 2011, Elites and Everyman, The Cultural Politics of the Indian Middle Classes. And actually fresh off the press in 2020, I guess, just before the pandemic, she released a wonderful book that is, again, really a delight to read, Uncivil City, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in New Delhi. Amita, it is really a pleasure for us to have you with us today, albeit virtually, and the floor is yours for your talk.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Thank you to you and to all the other organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure to be here, even though, as Marlene said, it's virtually, but I hope we will meet in some other time and in some other place. I'm now going to share my screen. Just let me know if that's working and whether you can see my slides. Is this working?
It's perfect. Yes, we see it perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. In case the slides stop for some reason, please don't hesitate to interrupt me and let me know, because sometimes I've had a little trouble with this. Okay, so the last year for us in India has been like no other. And the pandemic and its social and economic effects have cast a deep shadow over what I will say today, a shadow that paradoxically makes certain things stand out that much more clearly. And I'm going to talk about the pandemic today as experienced in India, but about its larger context and the lessons that it holds for social and ecological justice. One of these lessons has been the shifting of our attention from poverty alone to insecurity. Of course, the two are related, and the economist Amartya Sen has defined poverty as the lack of basic freedoms necessary to achieve certain minimum capabilities, and security is an intrinsic part of exercising those freedoms. But the pandemic has shown that insecurity can be much more widespread. In the last few months, Even those who were well off and imagined themselves insulated from hardship found themselves gasping for breath, seeking scarce oxygen. Even the affluent couldn't find a bed in an ICU. The virus made everyone vulnerable, and privilege was no protection. Economically, too, almost no one was spared. White-collar workers, freelance professionals, others in the gig economy, business people, others found their comfortable incomes drying up. Of course, there were the fault lines between those who had a cushion to fall back on and those who didn't, those who fared better and those who did worse. But everyone encountered uncertainty in an unprecedented way. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about uncertainty and its associated insecurity from the perspective of social and ecological justice. I shall begin with the pandemic and lockdown in urban and rural India, and I shall go on to talk about the larger political, economic, and ecological context that created catastrophic effects in people's lives. And I shall end by discussing what we as sociologists and citizens can do to change things for the better. So first, the pandemic, which for us really began last year in March with a few cases, mainly Indians who traveled abroad, bringing back the virus with them. So in March last year, the government announced that a total lockdown would start within 4 hours. During the 40 days that followed, people were banned from stepping out of their homes except to buy essential supplies. All places of work, private and public offices, with the exception of essential things like hospitals or banks, grocery stores, but all of the shops and factories, schools and colleges, restaurants and theaters, everything was closed down. Public transport was stopped and the movement of private vehicles discouraged. The government told employers to pay full wages to all workers during the period of lockdown. Well, after that, things eased up over the next 4 months, from May onwards. And then the first wave of infections, distress, and disease arrived in October, November last year in the cities. Cases again then subsided over the winter. But then there was this huge rise in the number of cases and deaths from early April this year, just a few months ago. Every day brought news of someone that I knew dying, and almost every family I know has suffered and is still struggling with illness and its lingering aftermath. 26 million cases, 300,000 deaths, but the numbers are really the tip of the iceberg, and they're grossly underreported in a country where even in the usual course, the vast majority of illness and death goes unrecorded. So this month, lockdown has eased again, and now we're waiting for the so-called third wave. Who knows when it'll come, and who knows what it will bring. So the pandemic and the economic lockdown have brought into focus the predicament of migrant workers as people without place. Deprived of productive resources and denied state welfare, migrants inhabit an in-between world where crafting livelihoods with dignity and security is a perpetual struggle. So let me enter the world of migrant workers by talking about women and girls who make up the ranks of domestic workers, who are essential to the smooth running of the middle and upper class Indian household. Most of them come from rural areas. They belong to low caste, low income groups, and they move to cities and towns in search of a better livelihood. What happened to them during the lockdown? Well, although the government had urged employers to pay workers during this period, only a tiny proportion of domestic workers received full wages. The majority were told by their employers that since they hadn't worked, they wouldn't be paid or they'd be given only a part of their salary. Some employers justified holding back wages by saying that their own earnings had declined because of the lockdown, and they had to tighten their belts. Others said that they paid their workers in order to ensure that a good worker, someone who is diligent, familiar with the household's routine, a good worker would feel obliged to return, and that's why they paid them. But whether they paid them grudgingly or gladly, employers acted as if they were doing workers a favor and expected them to be grateful. Domestic workers couldn't demand wages as a right, they had to beg and cajole. A woman who worked for an affluent household for 20 years reported that when she indignantly said, "I'm not asking you for alms, main bhik to nahi mang rahi, I'm asking you for what is due to me," her employer sacked her, saying, "I don't like your attitude. You can't speak to me like that." So the lockdown brought to the surface the deep-seated tensions inherent to this relationship of class dominance and mutual dependence. When it eased up, dependencies battled against suspicion. While middle-class women were desperate to hand over chores to domestic workers again, several resident welfare associations, or RWAs as they're called, neighborhood organizations or property owners, fearful about the spread of infection, continued to maintain a strict quarantine. And this set off furious debates within gated communities. While women residents were keen to have domestic workers come back and resume their duties, the male-dominated RWA executives held out for postponing their entry as long as possible. And when workers were finally let in, they were subjected to new forms of segregation in some gated communities, such as being prohibited from using elevators and forced to use stairs. Remarkably, domestic workers were characterized as the carriers of contagion, a threat to middle-class homes, even though during this period, the virus was being transmitted almost entirely by well-to-do Indians who had traveled abroad. For domestic workers, the announcement of lockdown in March last year and that sudden suspension of employment was a huge shock. Most of them could not collect the back pay that they were owed for the month of March. Most experienced an immediate crisis in making ends meet. Working class women's paid work in middle class households stabilized the income of their own households. Women's salaries were often more reliable than the irregular jobs that men found on construction sites, peddling rickshaws, in small trades and street vending. With women and men out of work, even feeding the family soon became a challenge, with domestic provisions and cooking fuel going out of reach. While the cost, of course, of rent, school fees, electricity, medical bills, and other everyday essentials became impossible to bear. So in working class settlements, dense packed shanty towns where residents share water sources and toilets, where physical distancing is impossible, fear of getting infected fused with the fear of starvation. Within the first weeks of the lockdown, almost all bastis, as working class neighborhoods are called, emptied out as those who were renting places to live decided to head home to the villages that they came from. So this then was the crux of the appalling tragedy that unfolded last year in April and May. Millions of migrant workers thrown out of jobs, their savings fast dwindling, trying to get to a place of safety, but handicapped by the shutting down of buses and trains and by the closure of state borders. Hundreds of thousands of desperate people decided to walk home, trudging thousands of kilometers in killing heat, pulling along and carrying their children, their possessions bundled on their heads and under their arms, their mouths parched and their bellies empty, aching bodies and blistering feet. This was the biggest exodus that India had seen since the partition of the country in 1947. More than 300 people died along the way, killed in road and train accidents, collapsing from dehydration, hunger, heart attacks, exhaustion, and quite likely the virus. And what was this home to which they were returning? To understand this, one must know something about rural India. A little more than 47%, or almost half of all Indians, still depend on agriculture. And yet, 101 million rural Indian households, or 56% of rural Indian households, have no agricultural land. Of those who do, 85% own small and marginal farms, each with less than 5 acres of land. Water, nutrients, credit are the other resources in short supply. So precarious rural agrarian economy and the absence of basic amenities in rural areas forces more and more Indians to travel to cities and towns and to areas of capital-intensive agriculture, traveling vast distances across states in search of remunerative work. Almost all the work in this informal economy, a term that covers diverse occupations and work arrangements, this informal economy employs 93% of India's workforce. And what binds all of these workers together is their vulnerability. The absence of job security, decent wages, healthcare, and other occupational safeguards, and the denial of state welfare. So we're talking about almost complete insecurity. So these workers walk a precarious tightrope, balancing low-paid jobs and trades in the city with seasonal agricultural work in the countryside. We must remember that the Indian economy marches to the beat of the monsoons. When urban construction work stops during the rainy season, workers return to their villages to help with the labor-intensive tasks of plowing and sowing and weeding. The lockdown caused this tightrope between the city and the village to suddenly slacken so that migrant workers tumbled into free fall. No safety net of state support, such as unemployment benefits, protected them in their urban workplaces. Their modest savings were soon eaten into. With no prospect of work in the days ahead, they stared starvation in the face. Under the circumstances, the village that they had left beckoned as a refuge, a place where their families and wider social networks could provide a modicum of sustenance. Despite a law that protects migrant workers' rights, and despite a 10-year-old universal portable social security number called Aadhaar, state entitlements, meager as they are, remain tied for the most part to rural residents. And of these, subsidized food grains are the most important. But in some rural districts, so also are employment guarantee programs that provide 100 days of employment for minimum wages. Most pressingly, returning to the village meant avoiding the monetary drain of paying rent and purchasing food and other essentials in the city when earnings had stopped. Now, migrant workers keenly felt the irony of having to ask their rural family members for money to return home. Until now, they had been the providers of cash. Their remittances funded the rebuilding of a house, the deepening of a well, the wedding of a sister or a daughter. During the festive seasons of Diwali and Eid, male migrants visited their villages laden with gifts, a new sari for a mother, a mobile phone for a brother, toys for children, and they brought city savoir-faire with them and were looked upon as well-traveled sophisticates. Now there was the ignominy of returning empty-handed and defeated. as a grim-faced man standing in a serpentine queue to get a polythene packet of food from a charity organization remarked, "Roti hi nahi, izzat chali gayi." We've lost not just bread, but we've lost our honor. For the workers who kept one foot in the city and the other in the countryside, there's perhaps no real home. Treated as interlopers in the cities where they work, they're reminded at every turn that they're there on sufferance, their bastis or shanty towns under the ever-present threat of demolition, their regional identities used to disparage and discriminate against them. They label Bihari or Bhaiya, people from Eastern India, Northeast India, and so on. Even after living in the city for decades, their claim to urban citizenship, their right to vote, entitlements to subsidized food, education, and healthcare, all of these remain tenuous. On the other hand, the agrarian economy has no room for them, and the traditional anchor of family, caste, and village is not enough to keep bodies and souls together. And here's a footnote, and it's by no means a trivial consideration, but when faced with the prospect of dying, migrants returning to their village could at least console themselves that they would be cremated or buried by their kin in the ritually prescribed manner. So the notion of a good death was an important element of the way in which people fled the cities. It was not just to do with the economic hardship, even though that was primary, but the idea of dying somewhere anonymous and alone also moved people to go back to their village. But out of place in the city and out of work in the village, many migrant laborers live with displacement as a permanent condition. Despite the widely reported vivid evidence of hardship and suffering among laid-off workers, better off sections of society in India neither sought to help them nor pressured the state to provide aid. Several NGOs, charitable organizations, and individuals stepped in with cooked food and provisions, but their capacity falls far short of the scale of support required. Even emergency aid was inadequate, let alone the more durable resources to keep households going. At a time when the rhetoric of a united India has been raised to fever pitch by the Hindu nationalist government and its supporters, this callousness towards fellow citizens appears all the more appalling. And yet, the word callousness does not quite capture the essence of this phenomenon. Concern for the fate of less fortunate others is against the rules of this starkly divided social landscape where elite privilege is predicated upon continued exploitation. The Indian middle classes, the Indian elite, bases their very existence on the labor of the working class while keeping them invisible and at a distance. Domestic workers, for example, perform chores within the intimate confines of small city apartments where there can be no spatial distance. Yet, through a variety of practices that discipline the worker's body, where she can sit, whether she's allowed to use the bathroom or enter the kitchen, these kinds of acts of disciplining the worker's body and delimiting what she can do. For instance, she's not allowed to drink or eat from the same dishes. She can't speak to her employer as an equal. Through these practices, the middle classes routinely mark out and maintain social distance, even when spatial distancing is not possible. To the middle class, the working classes are essential to the smooth running of the household, and at the same time, they're a source of risk that must be managed. What explains this dualism? It's Indian caste ideology that is central to this contradiction, ingrained into the habitus of every upper caste Indian. And this includes not only Hindus, but also Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and followers of other religions. Ingrained into everybody's minds is the notion of pollution. Within the caste system, pollution is closely tied to bodily substances, hair, saliva, excreta, menstrual blood, and the dead body. Those who deal with polluting substances are by association deemed to be polluted and therefore dangerous, since they can pollute others. Thus, the very people who earn a living from cleaning upper caste homes and from washing the bodies of upper caste children and the elderly, workers who remove the dirty products of upper caste bodies are themselves rendered dirty and polluting. Their labor is needed, yet their dangerous bodies must be distanced from upper caste ones. They are abject, to use Julia Kristeva's term, and their proximity provokes revulsion and rejection. Domestic workers' bodies form the constitutive other against which upper caste, middle class Indians understand themselves. Social distancing is second nature to them. So this cultural imagination of workers as productive labor within polluting bodies, as a danger, and yet still a necessity that must therefore be managed, is complicated by India's large population. For the middle classes, there are just too many poor people. Their presence is a drag on the path of economic progress. Ignoring the entire question of enduring social and economic inequalities that make their lives possible, differences in consumption, the fact that the top 10% of the Indian population holds 77% of total national wealth, and that inequality in income and wealth has been increasing rapidly since the 1990s, when policies of economic liberalization were adopted. The middle class blames the poor for their poverty and for the nation's failure to achieve the status of an economic superpower. In the middle class imaginary, the death or disappearance of a few million of this vast reserve army of surplus labor would not be a cause of mourning, for they have already deemed them to be lesser beings. Perceived as a dehumanized multitude, these bodies are of little value, and if the virus claims them, well, there are plenty more where they came from. So the lockdown and the pandemic are what sociologist Veena Das calls critical events, cataclysmic moments in collective life that lay bare the structures of everyday life. They have brought to the surface the steely indifference of the state and elites to the fate of the working classes, an indifference that in so-called normal times lay concealed behind the brisk transactions between employers and workers. But by shattering this public secret, COVID-19 may precipitate a crisis of legitimation as desperate workers rise in anger, in dismay. If that change in the world is to come, it's likely to begin at home, or rather it's likely to begin with the idea of home, a place of security and comfort, a hope that has been denied to countless Indians. I began my career as a sociologist in 1990. Living in the highlands of the Narmada Valley in central India, in a village of Bhilala Adivasis, or roughly translated, members of an indigenous group who were fighting against being displaced by a large dam. The dam was built and people were forced to move from their lands and forests by the river. But a generation later, there is little difference between those who were forcibly evicted to make way for the dam and their kin in neighboring villages. Those who live on by the river spend 9 months of the year laboring on construction sites and agricultural fields hundreds of kilometers away. The land can no longer sustain them. The forests have shrunk. The river is a dead reservoir. And their ideas of the good life are now no longer contained by the village. They seek the bustle of the city, urban pleasures, the glitter of commodities. And even if they can't afford them, the allure of commodities and the city is enticing. Writing about Rwandan refugees, anthropologist Lisa Moltke said, I quote, that people have always moved, whether through violence or desire, unquote. But how do we separate desire from violence that's not always physical, but also structural and epistemic? Those of you who focus on the issue of refugees into Europe will know this, the difficulties of separating, or the ways in which violence and desire blur into each other. The push and pull factors that an earlier generation of demographers and geographers could use to categorically separate refugees from migrants blur when we think about domestic workers, service providers, and factory laborers, men and women who can't any longer make a living on the land, for whom the village is a backward, benighted place, and the city beckons as the only beacon of hope. As sociologists, what do we do with our familiar categories of the rural and the urban when the people who inhabit them don't feel that they belong to either? How did we get here? Since the 1990s, India has pursued policies of economic liberalization, market-led growth through partnership between the state and private capital. This has led to the privatization of public assets and common property resources, from the airwaves for telecom to coastal waters to large tracts of land. Environmental regulations, weak as they are, have been diluted even more to let politicians and big business make more money. The environment has been destroyed, and those who depend most directly on it have been just swept aside. This is what David Harvey called accumulation by dispossession, and it has deepened the inequalities that already mark the social landscape of India. The effects of this degradation are manifest even in the areas that benefited from this so-called development. The model of fossil fuel and water-intensive farming, which has created a crisis in the richest agricultural areas of the country, is now being extended to dryland regions where farmers hope to strike it rich by taking on huge risks, made larger still by changing rainfall patterns, floods, droughts, and extreme events. They're drowning in debt, they're selling off assets to pay off these debts, and they're killing themselves, literally. Every 30 minutes, a small or medium farmer in India commits suicide. Liberalization has unleashed dreams of a better life, of consuming more, of living better, of aspiring to be like those higher up in the hierarchy. But for most small farmers, artisans, landless workers, those dreams are just that. They are fantasies, fantasies that can prove to be fatal. Economic and social insecurity is likely to only grow in a culture where capitalism converges with caste and patriarchy. Equally, environmental risk and uncertainty are likely to only grow as pandemics and climate change play havoc with already precarious lives. The challenges posed by economic and ecological precarity in rural and urban India show that long-standing categories of analysis, rural and urban, native and migrant, fail to contain and explain the landscapes that people traverse and the lives that they lead. For ecological and social justice, we need concepts and theories of change that do justice to the constancy of impermanence. When writing this talk, I had planned to spend some time discussing collective action. I was going to draw on Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, and argue that whenever the economy seems to dominate over society, there will be counter movements. This resistance can take many forms. It can be progressive or regressive. It can be socialist or fascist. And in India too, counter movements have combined the politics of recognition and the politics of redistribution, to use Nancy Fraser's terms, in ways that span the ideological spectrum. In the last 2 years alone, there have been powerful campaigns through electoral politics and on the streets to make India a Hindu nation and to keep it a secular republic. Groups have fought to maintain social welfare programs that the government is bent upon reducing. They're fighting to stop corporate takeover of lands, forests, wetlands. All these are attempts to find security, political, economic, ecological. And as these attempts pit one vision of justice against another, one must ask which version of justice best coincides with the principles of equality. Equality not just between individual humans and social groups, but equality or justice between species and between generations. What one must therefore ask, which version of justice best coincides with these principles, and one must work to achieve it. I want to end by drawing inspiration from those people who have always lived with insecurity, small farmers, migrant workers. And my research in rural India was among people who live constantly with hunger and malnutrition, for whom healthcare was pretty much non-existent, where every mother I knew had watched her infants die, and everything from diarrhea to snake bite added to the tiny graves dotting the hillside in each village. Untimely death sat at their shoulder like a constant companion to life. In urban India too, now I've witnessed growing working class families who don't know whether they will eat tomorrow, people who deal routinely with disaster and distress, and of course now with the pandemic, also with untimely death. So what emotional and psychic resources must these people have cultivated to live with chronic insecurity? And as the idea of being in control, of being masters of our destiny, becomes more and more a fiction for people across the world, perhaps we can learn to be resilient from those who have had a lifetime's lesson in surviving against the odds. I will stop here. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Amita. Thank you for that wonderful talk and for bringing those images into our world, images that are not at all familiar to many of us, I would say, and also recounting the situation that you've experienced and witnessed in India across this pandemic. Really harrowing, I would say, images and information that you've shared here with us. This idea of impermanence, a theory of impermanence, I find this so compelling, how to study and understand people who belong to nowhere. And I very much like what you were suggesting at the end, that somehow these people may have certain capabilities that allow them to be more resilient, and hopefully, and you alluded to this a little bit as well, hopefully to be able to engage in some forms of resistance, let's say. So I have maybe two questions, and maybe Adi also has some questions. And then, of course, we'll take questions from the floor. We have our audience with us here this morning. And I just want to remind everyone, do feel free to put your questions into the chat, and then we'll call on you. So prepare your questions and write them in. So perhaps a first question. Would you find that it would be useful perhaps to look at this question of the good life in a little bit more depth? You mentioned the good life, and to me it alludes to potentially work on human well-being, human and planetary well-being, maybe in combining the two, that would lead us to either reflect on human needs or human capabilities. And already using perhaps existing theories to understand in what way these different people that you're looking at are able to acquire certain capabilities, but perhaps also trying to recognize that these capabilities are not only emerging at the level of individuals, but individuals within certain social and political contexts, and what the role might be of society in making sure that people are able to access minimum human needs or access the capabilities needed to be resilient in the face of impermanence, in the face of crises, etc. So I was wondering if you've engaged with those theories of human well-being, and if not, what your thoughts are perhaps on this notion of the good life, and perhaps whether a different societal discourse is needed that moves this idea of the good life away from the traps of consumerism, work to spend, accumulation of credit, etc., to think of the good life in terms of access to green open spaces, access to a sense of community, to another, let's say, another level. Can we start having another level to the societal discourse around good life, so that it is not completely trapped, let's say, in capitalist understandings of what the good life might be, material understandings? And then I just have another question that's maybe more, anecdotal, or based on what evidence you might have in having followed this pandemic. Here in Europe, we saw that a lot of city dwellers actually sought refuge in more rural areas during the pandemic. They wanted to escape the constraints of the city that imposed limited physical mobility. So people were apparently buying up secondary homes if they could afford them, or traveling to secondary homes. And this was a form of, elite reappropriation of more rural, or at least peri-urban areas. And I was wondering if anything similar might have happened in India. And it comes back to this idea of the urban being the only image of the good life. Perhaps a trend towards going back to the country, so to speak, might also create a new idea of the good life, more tied to proximity to nature. So those are just a few questions or reflections that I've had in listening to you this morning. So if you'd like to respond, and then maybe Adi can ask some questions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. These are really sort of generative questions, so thanks so much. I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly, but the movement for the good life, Bon Viver, in Latin America, the movement coming out of Bolivia, from indigenous groups, environmental groups, in some ways tries to encapsulate the idea that this kind of blind rush to maximize economic growth is not, in fact, making people happy. It's shattering communities. It's destroying the very ecological basis on which all life depends. So the need to rethink the ultimate goals of development has been a central issue in these struggles in Latin America. And even in India, when one looks back at movements in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, before economic liberalization became the dominant discourse, we find, for instance, the anti-dam movement in the Narmada Valley saying, well, what is development? What does development mean if it makes rich people richer and poor ones poorer? What does it mean if it takes a living river, a river held sacred by people who live along its banks, and turns that river into a stagnant series of reservoirs? So there's a way in which the notion of maintaining communities and their links to the natural environment that they depend on, and using that alternative cultural perception of the good life as a challenge and critique of the dominant idea of development as industrialization and consumerism and urbanization, was a small but nonetheless very powerful stream of thought within Indian political life till, as I said, the 1990s. And then gradually it's just declined. And it's to do with the way in which the coming in of commodities into rural India's consumer items which have been priced at low value, which allow even relatively poor villagers to consume biscuits and instant noodles and all kinds of processed goods that they didn't have earlier. The way in which a wave of cheap consumption has hooked people who can't, in fact, really even afford this into a larger circuit of aspiration. This is something that I discuss in my other work on consumer citizenship, where I look at the role of processed foods in making the people who have been stigmatized and marginalized, people who belong to the lower castes, who are poor people, consuming certain kinds of goods advertised on television, junk foods basically, just makes them feel that they're part of a larger republic of consumption. And so the idea of consumption as a space where you can exercise political agency has come to replace the notion of production as a sphere where you need to fight over control, over your rights as workers within the Indian polity. So, I think that's a lot to do with the way in which there's been a convergence in terms of a consumption-oriented capitalism that is both cutting the ground from under people's feet in terms of production, but also kind of, incorporating them, bringing them in through the proliferation of these cheap commodities that people can consume. So the idea of the good life in India, a debate which was active, which drew a lot on Gandhian roots till the 1990s, has unfortunately now, sort of ebbed away. And even the pandemic doesn't seem to have quite, helped to revive it as it has in other places. The second issue of city dwellers retreating to rural areas to escape the virus is actually an interesting one, because in India, elites have traditionally escaped from the city to their second homes in the countryside in, say, the summer months. So people go into cooler places in the mountains, what are called hill stations, first actually developed by the British, but adopted by the Indian elite as a kind of seasonal pattern of spending the summer in some cool mountainous second home. This kind of elite retreat has, in fact, the idea of having a backup home in a clean rural, place with a nice climate has actually expanded a lot as elites have become richer, but also as cities have become much harder to live in because of, say, pollution levels. So now people go away from the city into these rural second homes when in the month of October, pollution over North India, air pollution, becomes this thick blanket of smog. However, there is still this issue that in these rural areas, you still don't have the kind of medical infrastructure that elites take for granted. So if you want access to a hospital with, multiple specialities, with an intensive care unit, with ventilators, you need to be close to a city. So the elite, do I think invest more and more in buying up rural areas and having these homes, but at the same time, for certain kinds of amenities, they do need the city. So they're leading this double life, just actually as the migrants that I described earlier, but of course from a position of privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amita. I'm still recovering from the talk, and I don't have questions. I just have some thoughts, and they're going to be very rambling and incoherent. But and part of the reason why they're going to be rambling and incoherent is because as much as I'm sort of familiar with the context you presented today, every time I encounter it, it astonishes me. It just leaves me stupefied. And I think one of the richness of your work, lies in the fact that, one can do all the conceptual, theoretical cartwheels, and framings. And in fact, when I was listening to you, I was thinking, this really does put a challenge to the notion of precariousness and precarity as Judith Butler has recently developed. Really, I mean, what your work is very clearly showing is that they are so braided that to even attempt theorizing them as separate in any shape or form is simply a point, an exercise in futility. But what really throws me, and this is sort of what I'm struggling with at the moment myself, because I am writing about the unfolding pandemic in India, albeit from a very medical, sociological point of view. What I'm really struggling here with is that where does my complicity as a social scientist and as a thinker and a sociologist lies in all of this? And I don't have the language and the vocabulary to quite enunciate it very coherently, but I feel slightly disingenuous when I write about it. I feel complicit. I feel I'm part of the problem, and I want to be part of the solution. So, and what I'm struggling in my own work at the moment is to somehow find a way in which to begin to reimagine how, by creating these diagnoses, which we do as sociologists and anthropologists, for example, every bit as brutal as your work shows, the middle class sense of entitlement and privilege, and the dehumanizing sort of way in which other humans get co-opted in that vortex of middle class privilege. That is every bit as searing and correct as we tend to analyze it. But I am very much benefiting peripherally, however peripherally, from the structural violence that I comment on as part of my day job. And for me to be able to, in a very reflexive manner, take a step back and be able to, in some sense, dissect my own predicament in this unfolding scene of horrific violence, which is systemic, persistent, chronic, and the pandemic only just exposed it in technicolor detail, right? It remains so subcutaneous and lurking in the banality of the everyday, but suddenly this exceptional moment, the critical event, as you rightly gestured at, emerges, and absolutely the emperor has no clothes, and we can blame the state, we can blame the middle class, sense of entitlement, we can blame sort of forces of capital that are restructuring fortunes in very particular ways. But as social commentators, as researchers, as sociologists, how do we begin to take a reflexive view? And I really love the way you ended on how one can begin to learn. And one of the things that really astonished me when I saw the pictures of, presumably from Narmada, of those women, that the thought that went through my head was that there's just something in their gaze which is so uncontaminated. And at one level, this could be just pure exoticization and essentialization. But at another level, there is a certain searing, penetrating, otherness to that gaze, which really makes you sit up, jolts you into sort of noticing it. And I mean, I don't know if it's possible to bring the picture back, but there was just something in that gaze, the clarity, the way in which they were looking at the camera and the questioning was just quite astonishing. So in a sense, I'm sorry, this is sort of rambly and slightly self-indulgent, but I am wondering if there is a way out of this conundrum, that as sociologists, how do we position ourselves, place ourselves as spectators, and as spectators of this very structurally violent spectacle unfolding on my watch, as I like to call it sometimes. So yes, there is not a coherent question here. It's just something for us to think about. But I'd love your thoughts on it, if you think there is a way in which one can begin to chart a course out of this seemingly intractable problem space. She crashed out.
No, thank you. No, I'm there.
Oh, sorry, you're there. Your camera switched off. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm sorry, the doorbell rang, so I had to run and pick up a package. But I was listening to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you've asked, Aditya, a very difficult question, because it's a question that, I end up asking myself all the time, as do those friends of mine who work in similar circumstances. The difficulty is that academia is built around the idea that you must present something new and original. You must have some new concept or some new argument that you can present. I feel that pressure myself. So in this talk, what I've tried to do is, hope to say something new. But I'm very conscious that what I'm presenting is actually a very old, very familiar, one might say even, tired story that everybody probably in this audience is familiar with. I mean, if not in the Indian context, in some other context, people know about what capitalism does to the environment, to communities, all the rest of it. None of this is new. The desperate measures that people take to fight against the immense odds that they encounter, the lives that they lead to survive. I mean, even this is not new in some way or the other, in different contexts, not just in the global south. I mean, even in the north, those scholars at this conference who are working with refugees, with the homeless, this. So nothing that I'm saying is particularly new. And yet our discipline rewards us for saying, being what's called, cutting edge. It's hard to be cutting edge when, all you can hope to do is perhaps be a witness and, bring into circulation certain kinds of stories, certain kinds of arguments, which would otherwise not be there. In India, we have, as you know, a strong tradition of public sociology. You write for the papers, you take part in, mass meetings. Because you're an educated person from the city, if there's a meeting going on at the grassroots level in a village or something, they will ask you to speak, and you speak and try and make connections that you hope will help people think more deeply about the kinds of struggles they're a part of. You hope to inspire them by saying, hey, in Bolivia, this is what they're fighting for. Do you know that in New Zealand they've given a legal status to a river? They've recognized the river as an entity. What does that mean in the Indian context? So there's a way in which one, by interacting outside of academia, through the media, for the general public, one can open up the conversation. And that also means that, we have to drop some of the kinds of, specialized jargon that we think of as being professional, speaking in a certain way, citing a certain literature, just being more accessible. Maybe it means not writing in English or speaking in English, but being able to use another language. Because English in the Indian context is a language that excludes the vast majority of the country. These are difficult things to do for those of us who've been, educated in English, who inhabit a certain world. All our training as scholars and academics has been to succeed in one particular way. So we have to kind of, undo that training or add a different kind of training to it to be able to take our work outside. But at the same time, often, I'm very aware that to people who are engaged in struggles, I'm not the one who's going to give them ideas because, this is my world is engaged in a certain set of, arguments which may have no great resonance on the ground. But at the same time, I think that the most important way in which I practice the politics of what I also study is through teaching. And it's through working with students who will one day go on to be bankers or, people in the media or something else. It's through students, especially undergrad students, that I want to make a mark, because I see that relationship as particularly important, particularly something that you can mold, where things that have happened in the classroom, conversations you've had, things you've made people read, will actually stay with them and will perhaps be a part of what they go on to practice later. That's a kind of long answer to your question. But I really do think that, and I think people who study migration have said this before, so again, it's not new, but to turn the world upside down so that we think not of stable categories as universal and the departures from stable categories as aberrations, but to see instability and impermanence themselves as the constitutive feature of life experiences for perhaps the majority of the world's population. I think turning that viewpoint around is a very important way of transforming how we as academics look at the world. In particular, I see this conversation happening, for instance, among historians who now concentrate much more on oceans. And to concentrate on oceans and the traffic that happens around oceans is to some ways get away from solidity of land and the idea of land-based categories like nation states. It's to immediately shift your attention to the movement between land masses. And I can think of no better work that really kind of sums this up than Amitav Ghosh's novel Gun Island, which is about Bengalis in this great delta of the river Ganges, which is a place of mangroves. and a place which has steadily been eroded by rising sea levels, where life has become much more precarious because of the number of storms and hurricanes increasing because of climate change. And Ghosh goes to Venice. And what does he find? He finds all the vendors around him speaking in Bengali, construction workers speaking in Bengali, because those are the circuits that people have traveled for a long time, but those circuits have become even more important. The movement of people because of changing environments, and both these movements of environments as well as people should make us rethink the ways in which we think of our discipline, and or we think of even social change as, you know, moving from one steady state to another state of equilibrium. Perhaps now equilibria are no longer possible. I mean, we know that from the idea of the Anthropocene that we've exceeded certain planetary boundaries. So we're living in a constant state of flux, and that must then reflect itself in our practices. I mean, the fact that we're having an online conversation shows how our ways of proceeding have changed. But then so must our ways of thinking. I'm sorry, I give very long answers.
No,
No, it was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Right.
very, very inspiring and wonderful. And we have two people here that we're going to give the floor to ask their question. The first is Graziella Moraes Silva, also from the Graduate Institute. Graziella, the floor is yours. And then we'll give the mic to Mallory Jeanne, a PhD student here at the University of Geneva. Go ahead, Graziella.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for a great talk, Amita. It was really a pleasure to hear you, even if the topic is very hard and the images are very strong and hard to digest in many ways. But I guess I wanted to hear you a little bit more. I mean, your talk really showed that the pandemic was a bit of a window into the structural inequalities in India, and people could not ignore it. So it really brought forward all the tensions and how this is in many ways an unsustainable type of inequality. And maybe trying to be optimistic or trying to find a window of opportunity in all this, I was wondering if you can say if there was the pandemic allowed especially the rich and the elites to understand or to create a sense of interdependence. So in a way, realize that they cannot live in their bubble, and that could be in a way brought forward as a political movement for stronger welfare or other types of societies. Not out of goodwill, not as if that all of a sudden they are good, but because they realize that they need that workforce, or that they are more vulnerable to disease in any way. So in that sense that they need to live in the same country. Or if you feel that it's still, and you kind of hinted at it when you talked about the difference between men and women and how they reacted differently. But what are the narratives about poverty and about inequality in India? Have they changed at all among the elites and among the rich with this crisis? Thank you again very much for a great talk.
Thank you, Graziella. I keep hoping that this is going to happen. This idea of what has been called a binding crisis, a crisis that brings people together across social and economic differences, is something which is, one would think, a definition of climate change, for instance. It's a binding crisis. It doesn't matter whether you live in New York. Hurricane Sandy is still going to blow out your lights. If there are floods in Chennai, in South India, you would imagine that whether it's houses of the rich or the poor, everybody is going to get flooded. So this idea of the binding crisis is something that I would imagine in the Indian case would apply in the case of the horrific air pollution that affects North India in the season, in the months of October, November. We know that something like 25% of children in Delhi have respiratory diseases. We know that lives in the city where I live, Delhi, are probably cut short by 3 or 4 years. These are this is a paper published in the journal Lancet, because of air pollution. And you would think that if a child of a corporate executive is having to use an inhaler for asthma, can't go out to play because the air is too dirty, is sitting in a room with an air purifier, you're thinking, surely this will bring the executive together with working class populations who are much more exposed to air pollution and who don't have access to the kind of fancy, medical expertise or the kinds of air purifying gadgets, air conditioners, air purifiers that the rich can afford. But by and large in India, binding crises haven't really brought people together, mainly because, again, extreme inequalities have meant that sometimes elites have been able to basically buy their way out of a particular crisis. In the case of, say, dirty water in the taps, elite homes all have filters in their kitchen, or they can afford to buy bottled water. As I said, in the case of air pollution, there's technologies that cost a lot of money that rich people can do, and of course they can escape to their second home in the countryside. So the deep inequalities in India have usually meant that the kind of interdependence that you mentioned, an interdependence that should arise when we realize that we're all vulnerable to the virus, hasn't actually happened. So this in some ways is the paradox that we live with, that it's not only about everybody being vulnerable, but also about these interdependencies. People, upper class women in India can only be quote unquote modern. They can go out and hold, jobs and earn money and be financially independent because there's some other working class woman who's doing her chores at home. Because unlike in the West, where the feminist movement in its second wave renegotiated the division of labor within the household, in India, that division of labor in the household between men and women was never a point of contention, was never fought over, because the fact that there was this huge population of working class women to take over these jobs basically deferred the crisis. So I'd like to believe that, mutual dependence, crises that affect everybody would result in, a concerted effort to make sure that, as you said, there's state welfare for everybody. The poor get all kinds of benefits through employment generation programs, through insurance, through basic income, and so on. But unfortunately, what the elite are demanding are more hospitals for themselves, more ventilators. And so I think the pandemic is going to leave us with even more lopsidedness in healthcare, because now the investment is going to be in tertiary care, more ICUs, not rural healthcare in the villages where, there's hardly anything at all. So I'm sorry, I wish I could come up with a more optimistic account, but that's unfortunately not where we're at right now, at least in my view.
Thank you, Amita. And Mallory Zhan, who is a PhD student working on the zero waste movement in China, she has a question and she's unable to say it because she says she has construction work going on. So I'm going to read it. Thank you so much for the great talk. Farmers are leading one of the biggest social mobilizations in India in decades during the pandemic. The farmers see that further liberalization of the agricultural law as a threat to their livelihoods. They worry that agro-businesses and the financialization of agriculture will further displace, dispossess, and disempower farmers. Would you mind telling us a little bit about how the urban middle classes engage with such movements? Specifically, are the middle classes likely to become allies to such a movement given widespread sympathy? And it seems that the current movement does not have ecological concerns at the center. Do you believe that there could be more alliance building between this current movement and previous environmental movements such as the Save the Seeds movement? Thank you very much.
Great question.
Thank you, Mallory. You packed in a lot of things in that question. But you're absolutely right that when just before the second wave of the pandemic hit, there was this inspiring social movement where farmers, mainly from North India, but with representatives from around the country, had actually encircled the capital and were, at all the border entry points, the highways leading into Delhi, they were camped there. And in some ways, what their show of strength showed was if they wanted, they could block the border. And Delhi, with its population of whatever, 18 million people, would be deprived of the sources of food, all the other material that comes from outside. So what the farmers were actually pointing to was the way in which city populations are still totally dependent on rural areas to meet their needs for resources, to meet their consumption needs. So you're quite right that the farmers protested against the taking away of state support to them through state-controlled trading, markets, the subsidies that the state offered to them. But one has to, as you're saying, look at this from the point of view of farmers who were at the center of the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, a package of very resource-intensive agriculture that was fossil fuel intensive, water intensive. I showed a couple of pictures of that kind of agriculture, which was heavily supported by the state in order to make India self-sufficient in food grains. And what these farmers are protesting today is the taking away of those subsidies. So it's in some ways a rather ironic position, because at one level it's saying we're not going to allow big business to take over our lands, to take over agricultural trade, because that's going to place small and marginal farmers in an even more vulnerable position. So, but at the same time, it's asking for support for a mode of agriculture that is ecologically hugely unsustainable. So in this, very prosperous, very, productive region of Punjab in North India, there are trains that run regularly to a particular place where there's a cancer hospital, because the incidence of cancers in the region is extremely high because of the huge levels of agricultural chemicals, pesticides that people use in these, in their production. So there is a serious problem with the kind of agriculture that they practice. And as far as the urban upper middle classes or middle classes in general are concerned, there is a great deal of support for farmers, not at the level of understanding perhaps the issues in a very nuanced way, but just because the figure of the farmer as a person who produces food, related also to the fact that these are farmers who are, many of whom are Sikhs, and Sikhs in North India are, a community that are looked up to for a variety of reasons, their generosity, their self-reliance, and so on. So the figure of the farmer is almost romanticized by urban classes as, somebody who provides your food. And therefore, there's been a lot of sympathy. But that sympathy doesn't take into account the exact political ecology of this kind of agriculture. And those are therefore the limits of what these movements can achieve. There are other groups which are asking questions about agroecology and sustainability. And some people have started to ask those questions of the farmers' movement itself, saying, aren't you basically asking for an obsolete form of agriculture to be supported? Don't we need to go beyond this so that the movement is not in defense of existing state subsidies and protections, but is in fact a struggle to reach a new kind of understanding of agriculture?
Great, thank you so much. We still have time for one more question. If anyone would like to ask a last question, do feel free to raise your hand. I also wanted to mention, yesterday, Amita, I know you were in a semi-plenary on social housing, and we had a semi-plenary in parallel on sustainable consumption, social justice, with Seema Johnson, with Manisha Nantaraman, and I don't want to get her name right, Viviana Asada. And Viviana Asada, I mean, what we've been talking about, I think, this morning is interdependencies. And this is something that Bruno Latour brought to our attention at the very beginning of the pandemic, asking the question in times of crisis, who are our allies? Who are we with? Who are we against? Who do we depend on? And how do we develop alliances to better resist? But in our talk yesterday in the semi-plenary, we spent a bit of time talking about this notion of autonomy being sort of the rallying cry of a lot of the indignados, indignated, I think we say in English, movements.
Indigenous?
No, not indigenous, indigné, movements, particularly in Spain, that Viviana has been studying, that are trying to create autonomous communities. So to not be dependent, actually. And I thought this was a nice way also of reflecting on your point of the distinction between consumption and production, that somehow being autonomous is about reappropriating our means of production and taking control again of the substances that allow for certain livelihoods to prosper over others. So I think this idea of interdependence and looking at dependencies is important between farmers, the elites, etc. But even perhaps more important is how to foster a sense of autonomy among these, domestic workers, linking perhaps to what we were saying earlier about capabilities. Are people able to develop capabilities to live and organize their lives autonomously from patriarchal systems, on the peripheries of capitalist systems? I'm being hopeful, I guess, here at the end of our talk this morning. I don't know if you want to react to that, or we can also close there. It's up to you.
I would just say that, these continue to be struggles, and the struggle goes on, whether it's people trying to bring together domestic workers, whether it's people trying to create new forms of agroecology, which are, as you say, autonomous, which don't rely on, market-based resources, especially those that are, harmful chemicals, fossil fuel intensive things, seeds that people don't have control over anymore. So in that sense, I think, it's a struggle, and the struggle goes on, and people therefore, live with hope,
yes.
even as they realize the difficulties.
Yes. And I'm going to give the last question to Seema Johnson, who's with us. And I know you know each other. So yes. Seema, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marlene. And thank you, Amita, for yet another really interesting talk. It's always a pleasure to listen to it. And of course, I know you know all this, but you bring it out so starkly, and you make even Kristeva sound understandable, which is amazing. I was thinking about what Marlene said about autonomy, and we discussed this a bit yesterday, because my stand on this was in a way, and which I feel like when you talk about how, especially your Maggie noodle research, and how, people have been kind of incorporated into this system. They're part and parcel of it. There's no separating them, which makes me think that I mean, these other movements that are taking place, they're not necessarily autonomous. They're part of the system. So my pet peeve is that how do you use this system to change it? I mean, because our usual idea as critics, as critical scholars is that, we need to take this down. We need to dismantle the system as it is. But I would seem to think that there's so much, when you start doing research, empirical anthropological research, you see that everything is so mixed up. You don't know what's autonomous and what's not. You're part of it. So is there any way we could use this system? And I was thinking about what you said about the farmers, for instance, and, them actually wanting to keep part of an old system. Is there a way to use that movement to change it also? Because I mean, you could look at it as conservative in one way, and yet they do bring hope in a way too, right?
Yeah. By the way, I'm really sorry, Marlene and Seema, for having missed your session yesterday because of that clash. I was really interested in attending, but I listened to the recording. Thanks, Seema, for that. I mean, very thought-provoking question, but one that I think I at least can't satisfactorily answer. As you know, there are all these groups, all these efforts on the ground to try and forge a way forward. Mm-hmm. And you're right that for them, what is inside and outside, what is challenging the system, what from outside, what is working within, people use all kinds of tools, whatever is available at hand, because they can't afford to be ideologically purists, because the odds against them are just so high. So I think these are very messy struggles. I think in that people get clarity through the doing rather than through just thinking about them. And from their messiness, I think, we will come to learn exactly what the answers are. So let me leave it there, but thanks for that really important question.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking maybe we need to start thinking messy as well.
Yes, we can follow Donna Haraway and stay with the trouble. So thank you so much, Amita Baviskar. Thank you to all of our participants this morning. Adi also for us being here together this morning. It was such a pleasure. And a round of applause, I guess, from us. And we look forward to seeing all of you at the paper session that follows, and another keynote this afternoon. Peter Wagner will be speaking at 5 o'clock. So thank you again, and looking forward to seeing you at some of our other sessions today. Bye, everyone. And Amita, if you want to stay on, we can just maybe say a quick goodbye to you as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming and joining the conversation.